Maybe that sound wasn't there, but waking up at 5:30 a.m. to the shouts of men in blue tracksuits was probably worse than hearing it. More importantly, they had no choice. This wasn't a game. In the 1980s, South Korea was experiencing a major economic boom. After the war in the 1950s that split the Korean peninsula into North and South, the government worked to heal its wounds and had achieved incredible growth, and had no intention of slowing down. The entire country was buzzing with excitement in anticipation of the 1986 Asian Games and the 1988 Seoul Olympics. The government began rapidly promoting efforts to rebrand the country, aiming to attract tourists and showcase its remarkable prosperity. But behind the so-called miracle on the Han River, behind Korea's rapid rise, lay an incredibly painful and dark reality. In April 1981, a letter reached the office of then Prime Minister Nam Duk-woo. The letter was handwritten by President Chun Doo-hwan, a former general who had seized power through a military coup the previous year. It ordered strict protective measures to prevent begging and to deal with vagrants. The government had developed a street cleansing policy in preparation for the 1986 and 1988 Olympics. From that moment on, nothing would be the same. Under this new regulation, which allowed vagrants to be arbitrarily detained, so-called social welfare centers were established. In big cities like Busan, buses labeled Vagrant Transport Vehicle began to appear. The government was collecting people from the streets as if they were rabid dogs. Most of these welfare centers were private institutions that received government subsidies based on how many people they housed. In other words, the state paid each private institution per person they held a kind of commission, which strongly incentivized the center owners to round up more people. But it wasn't only the institution owners who benefited from this commission. Police officers themselves received bonuses for sending people to these centers and clearing the streets. Bonuses that began to be included in their salaries. It was said that homeless people, individuals with disabilities, especially orphan children, and even ordinary citizens who were stopped on the street and couldn't present ID, were all abducted in the name of this project and the commissions behind it. Dozens of such collection centers, both state-run and private, began to spring up. You weren't allowed to refuse, but even if you did, you'd be dragged away by force anyway. Thus began a persecution in 1980s Korea, but among those dozens of centers, one would later be remembered as the inspiration for the rumors behind the real story of Squid Game, and its legacy of suffering would be passed down through generations. Han Jun-son was just one of the many people taken there with his sister. It was a beautiful autumn day in 1984. At the time, around 8 or 9 years old, Han was enjoying a long-awaited city outing with his father and sister. However, Han's father still had some errands to run, and to keep the children from being a burden, he decided to leave them in the safest place possible, outside a police station. He thought it would only take a few minutes, and his children would be with the most trustworthy people in the city, police officers. But contrary to expectations, those officers would end up tearing the family apart. While the children waited, a bus pulled up in front of the police station and forcibly took them away. The police officer had already exchanged signals with the man receiving them. The children had no idea where they were being taken. Their father had told them to wait there, and they cried as they pleaded with the man on the bus, but it was in vain. They were making a lot of noise while crying and shouting, which angered the men in charge, men who were cruel and brutal. The bus took them to a private facility called the Brothers' Home. Han and his sister wouldn't leave that place for another 3.5 years, a period that would become a nightmare. People were being picked up for ridiculous reasons. Oh, why did you look like that? Why are you walking sideways? Why are your eyes that color? Why are your clothes torn? As I said, both the police and the institutions profited from this operation. The masked figures of the real-life game were running the entire show. Of course, families of the missing children would report them to the police, but you already know the story. There was no point in asking the very people who had taken them. The Brothers' Home was one of the largest social welfare centers and was located near a residential area in Limon County, southeastern Busan. Its private owner, Park In-kyun, persistently claimed that the center was founded to feed, clothe, and educate vagrants to purify society. On paper, each person taken to these centers was supposed to be held for only 1 year, receive training, and be reintegrated into society. But the truth was, many of them wouldn't see their friends or families again until after 1987, when more than 30 escapees revealed what was truly happening behind those walls, and the centers were shut down. The government wanted to present the country in its best light and remove vagrants from the streets before the Olympics. But the brothers' home turned into a site of the worst human rights violations, far from being a shelter for the homeless or a center for rehabilitation. It seemed like the country's image depended on removing orphans and the helpless from the streets to make the country appear safer and more prosperous. Later, proud officials would admit that people had been abducted and imprisoned at the brothers' home. But by then, it was far too late. Those taken there were just regular people trying to go about their daily lives. Orphans, disabled individuals, alcoholics, or simply unlucky souls who were caught up in the sweep. Years later, 9 survivors would speak to the media to describe what it was like to be held there. They said they were starved, exploited, and forced to work without pay in many of the camp's production facilities. You were woken up at 5:30 a.m. by the shouts of guards and forced to attend church with a specific bag in hand. You had to memorize and recite hymns perfectly. If your eyes wandered or you scratched yourself during service, you would learn what would happen. Not figuratively, but with real physical pain. Each so-called guest, or inmate, had daily labor quotas. Carry this much stone, build this many meters of wall, that was the minimum. If you were sick or injured and couldn't meet your quota, your punishment was a baseball bat. Choi was stopped by a police officer on his way home from school. What could possibly be in his bag? Just books and a leftover sandwich from lunch. But to that officer, he was a potential commission. The cop asked where he had stolen the bread from. Choi repeatedly insisted he hadn't stolen it, but it didn't matter. Eventually, hearing that he'd be let go if he confessed, Choi said he had stolen it, and that confession became his one-way ticket to the brothers' home. People were being corrected with freezing water and subjected to unspeakable horrors I can't even describe. You can imagine. Compared to this, the TV series was nothing. There was no choice, no effort to escape, nothing. Escape attempts often reported by fellow inmates who hoped to earn favor and avoid beatings. Because if someone did escape, the entire dorm, or its head inmate, would be punished. People were brought in without knowing how long they would stay, dressed in blue tracksuits, plastic shoes, numbered uniforms, and nylon underwear. Dormitories were so overcrowded that 4 people shared a single bed, and the daily menu consisted mostly of rotten fish and barley rice. At night, you had to watch your back, because as I said, your only concern wasn't just your life, but also your dignity. Evidence gathered later showed that people were used like slaves throughout the 1980s in construction sites, farms, and factories. A girl named Aksonia escaped the facility in 1986 at age 17, only to give birth a few months later. I don't need to say what led to that pregnancy. Her reason for escaping was that the center's staff were forging documents and selling the children abroad for adoption. She risked everything to prevent her baby from being sold. All the other sold children had parents searching for them. The numbers were terrifying. Between 1985 and 1986 alone, the South Korean government gave the brothers' homeowner $10 million in subsidies for the people they rounded up. Imagine how many were taken. But investigations in 1987 revealed that only about 10% of detainees were actually vagrants or criminals. Anyone without a permanent address or labeled as a beggar was forced to live in these facilities. Inmates were forced to work in 20 different factory fields, including wood and metal work, clothing, footwear, and fishing. Many also had to help build new buildings in Busan and Ulsan. Products made in these factories were exported to Japan and Europe, another source of profit for the owner. Even children had to work, especially in making fishing lines and hooks for export to Japan. If your product was flawed or not up to standard, the day would end with beatings, with bats and clubs. According to official numbers, which are probably unreliable, there were 3,128 inmates at the brothers' home in 1986, and nearly 1 in 5 had died due to the conditions. Estimates suggest the real numbers were much higher, but years passed without any change in conditions, until a surprise police raid in 1987 exposed the abuses. As a result, the facility was shut down. Owner Park In-kun was arrested, but was only sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for embezzling state subsidies. he died of natural causes in 2016, having spent the remainder of his life outside prison. Investigators found $5 million in his office from both state funds and illegal exports of forced labor products. But no one was ever held accountable for the human rights violations at the brothers' home. Even today, some of the people involved continue in politics, and the government rejected further investigations and actively fought against efforts to bring the story to light. No state institution ever issued an official apology. And because the government didn't want negative news to overshadow the Olympics, the story received minimal media coverage in 1987. To this day, the issue has been largely swept under the rug. But one survivor, Hanjun's son, managed to draw attention to his story through drawings and solo protests in front of government buildings. Maybe when he and his sister were taken from that police station, he thought something had ended. But somehow he survived and eventually found a way to speak out. As a result of Han's efforts, the Seoul Central District Court ordered the government to pay 4.6 billion won in compensation to 15 victims of the brothers' home. It's a modest sum, really. The court's final statement said the government, while praising the welfare state as defined in the Constitution, had labeled the socially disadvantaged, those suffering from poverty or illness, as vagrants and isolated them from society under the guise of harsh intervention. So this story wasn't the real story behind Squid Game, but it was certainly more horrifying than the fictional series that shocked the world. In short, it wasn't a game. It was real. In remote corners of the world, there are countless unknown joys and tragedies that we'll never hear about. But that's all from me this week. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember that I create everything on this channel by myself, and it's only your likes and comments that make this possible. Thank you once again for being part of my community, and I look forward to seeing you in our future videos. Until then, stay beautiful, stay natural, and stay you.